The bright lights of Newsfront TV's Manhattan studio glared down like an interrogation room. The cameras were already trained on the polished desk at the center of the set, and every inch of the place felt engineered to convey authority. From the bold red, white, and blue graphics on the giant screens behind the host's chair to the sharp angles of the overhead rigging. Victoria Vicky Carver sat in that chair, back straight, her posture radiating confidence. Her hair and makeup team had just stepped away, leaving her exactly as the audience expected, perfectly put together, with that faint smile that said she knew something you didn't. After 20 years in political media, Vicky had built her reputation on controlling every conversation she hosted. If a guest thought they could talk over her, they were mistaken. If they came to promote an agenda, she knew how to dismantle it, sometimes without even letting them finish a sentence. The control room hummed with quiet chatter through the host's earpiece. 30 seconds to live, Dan Reeves, the director, called out. Karen Douglas, the executive producer, stood just off camera, tablet in hand, watching the clock and the incoming feed from Washington, D.C. On the other end of that feed, in a tidy office inside the U.S. Capitol complex, Congresswoman Monique Harris was adjusting her navy blazer. The camera operator hired for the remote connection checked the lighting one last time. Monique nodded, a polite thank you, and returned her gaze to the small lens above her laptop screen. The National Mall stretched out behind her through a wide window, framed by the fading blue of an early evening sky. She'd done dozens of interviews since winning her seat, but this one was different. Newsfront TV had a reputation for hostile questioning, especially from Vicky Carver. Monique had watched enough of these encounters to know the rhythm: a sharp question, a few seconds for the guest to start answering, and then an interruption, a pivot, and a new question before the first could be addressed. She'd seen seasoned politicians flustered into incoherence by it. But Monique wasn't planning to be one of them. Her communications team had spent weeks preparing for this appearance. They'd pulled up transcripts and video clips, studied Carver's patterns, and role-played possible scenarios. Monique had answered the same kinds of questions dozens of times in rehearsal, always under the pressure of someone talking over her. And she'd handled worse in her years as a defense attorney in Georgia courtrooms, facing prosecutors who didn't bother to hide their disdain. The idea was simple: let Carver play her game for a while. Keep calm, stay on message, and wait for the right opening. Monique knew the value of timing. Back in Manhattan, Vicky tapped her notes on the desk, eyes flicking to the screen where Monique's image had just appeared in a preview window. "She looks ready," Karen remarked, her tone somewhere between skeptical and impressed. Vicky's lips curved into a faint smirk. "We'll see." The studio lights brightened another notch as the countdown hit single digits. The theme music swelled, brass and drums, loud enough to echo in the cavernous space. "Joining us now is Congresswoman Monique Harris from Georgia," Vicky said, as the red light blinked on. Her voice carried that familiar blend of warmth and challenge, like she was welcoming you into her home and daring you to put your feet on the furniture. Monique offered a polite nod, her hands folded on the desk in front of her. "Good evening, Vicky. Congresswoman, your party keeps talking about democracy being under threat," Vicky began, leaning forward just slightly. "But aren't you the real threat to democracy with your support for expanding the Supreme Court?" Monique opened her mouth to answer, but Vicky's gaze was already fixed on her like a hawk on its prey. The first pitch had been thrown. In the control room, Dan leaned toward his monitor. He could already feel the show's energy tightening like a coiled spring. This was what they'd planned for: ratings gold, if it went the way they expected. But in Monique's office, the Congresswoman's calm expression never wavered. She'd been here before, in courtrooms where the stakes were someone's freedom. The lights and the cameras didn't intimidate her. She drew a quiet breath, steady as stone, and began to speak. Monique Harris adjusted her blazer in her Capitol Hill office, remembering the hours she'd spent studying every one of Vicky Carver's interviews. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she replayed a line she'd told her team earlier that week. If I get one clear shot, that's all I need. She wasn't just here to answer questions. She was here to show exactly how a politician could stand her ground and maybe even turn the tables. The first question came like a fastball aimed at her ribs. Monique had barely drawn breath to answer when Vicky Carver's voice sharpened. "Before you give me your talking points, let's look at the facts," she said, eyes narrowing slightly, as if she'd already caught the Congresswoman in a lie. In her Capitol Hill office, Monique's smile didn't falter. She'd rehearsed this moment. She kept her hands folded on the desk, her tone calm. "What threatens democracy?" Hold on, Vicky cut in, raising one hand as though the audience at home needed saving from a dangerous answer. "Your voting record shows you've opposed every single election security measure Congress has brought forward. How is that protecting democracy?" In the Manhattan control room, Dan Reeves ticked his finger in the air. Interruption number 1. Karen Douglas was already smiling to herself. This was the rhythm they knew, the one that made their host a star. "If you'd let me finish," Monique replied, voice steady. "I was about to explain that what actually threatens democracy is voter suppression, which is exactly what those bills—" "I'm sorry, but that's just not true." Vicky broke in again, a patronizing smile forming. "Those bills require basic ID verification. Are you saying black voters can't get IDs? Because that sounds pretty racist to me." In her D.C. office, Monique kept her gaze locked on the lens. "What's racist," she began evenly, "is the assumption that requiring expensive documentation to exercise a constitutional right—" "Texas, Texas, Texas," Vicky waved dismissively, cutting her off for the third time. "Let's talk about the border crisis in your state. Your district is hundreds of miles from the border, but you keep voting against border security. Why do you hate border security?" Monique's lips tightened almost imperceptibly. "I don't hate border security," she said, a slight edge in her voice now. "What I oppose is wasting taxpayer money on ineffective solutions while ignoring the root causes." "Root causes?" Vicky laughed, leaning forward. "The root cause is that your party opened the floodgates." Dan marked it. 4 interruptions. The pace was quickening, and the producers were thrilled. Viewers loved the push and pull, and Vicky was in her element. She went on, "You voted against the border wall. You voted against increasing Border Patrol funding. You voted against the Remain in Mexico policy. When will you admit your policies are failures?" Monique inhaled slowly. "They're playing the script. Let them." "Vicky, if you're actually interested in my positions rather than just sound bites—" "Oh, I'm very interested," Vicky said. Her tone dipped in mock sincerity. "I'm interested in why you think American taxpayers should fund benefits for undocumented immigrants when we have homeless veterans on the streets." Dan leaned over to Karen, murmuring, "That's 5. "The false choice you're presenting—" "False choice? It's a budget reality." Vicky's voice rose, pressing harder. "Money spent on undocumented immigrants is money not spent on Americans. Why do you hate American citizens?" In the studio, even the camera operators grinned. This was classic Carver, righteous indignation. Monique's eyes didn't waver. "What I hate is when people use human suffering as a political football. What about the suffering of American families dealing with inflation because of your party's spending sprees?" Vicky interrupted again, her 7th cutoff in less than 4 minutes. "When will you take responsibility for the economic pain you've caused?" Monique tried again. The economic data shows inflation is killing American families," Vicky overrode her, voice now at full force. "Gas prices, grocery prices, housing costs, all skyrocketing under Democratic policy. When will you admit you failed the American people?" 8 interruptions, Dan noted, scribbling on his notepad. From the outside, Vicky was dominating. She was the one steering the conversation, keeping Monique on the defensive, piling question on question before the previous one could be answered. The formula had worked for years, but in Monique's voice, there was no panic. In her eyes, there was no confusion. She sat perfectly still, almost as though she was waiting for something. The truth was, she was. Monique remembered the words she'd told her team just 2 nights earlier. Let her run the table. Let her get comfortable. Then we'll flip it. In her mind, the rhythm of Vicky's interruptions had a countdown quality. One by one, the numbers were falling away. On the 9th, the game would change. "Are you finished?" The question wasn't loud, but it sliced through the broadcast like the sudden hush before a thunderclap. Vicky Carver blinked. For a split second, she wasn't the unshakable host of Carver's Corner. She was just a person caught off guard. "I'm waiting for you to answer any of my questions," Vicky said finally, her voice still sharp, but with a flicker of hesitation. "Oh, I'll answer them," Monique Harris replied, leaning forward slightly. Her tone had changed. There was a steadiness, an almost prosecutorial cadence. "But first, I have a question for you." In the control room, Dan Reeves froze mid-gesture toward the lighting tech. Karen Douglas's eyes narrowed. This wasn't in their plan. Monique's gaze didn't leave the camera. "Your own network had to pay hundreds of millions of dollars for lying about elections," she said evenly. "Maybe you should worry about your credibility before questioning mine." "I toa som isasal." It was as if the air itself paused. The Manhattan studio, with all its bright lights and polished surfaces, suddenly felt smaller. The faint hum of the cameras seemed louder. Vicky's expression froze, eyes wide for a moment, lips parting, but no words coming out. In her D.C. office, Monique kept her posture relaxed, as though she'd just asked about the weather. Dan glanced at Karen. "We have a problem," he murmured into his headset. For Vicky, the silence stretched like an eternity. She could hear the faint shuffle of papers from someone in the crew, the low buzz of a floor manager's whisper. She knew millions were watching. She also knew, though she'd never admit it, that there was no quick comeback for this. "That's not—" Vicky began, but her voice caught. "You've interrupted me 8 times in the last 5 minutes, Monique continued, not raising her voice but increasing her pace just slightly. "You've asked me about voter ID, border security, spending, and inflation. But you haven't mentioned that your network paid nearly $1 billion for spreading election lies. You haven't mentioned that your own text showed you knew those claims were false. You want to talk about credibility? Let's talk about yours." Vicky's grip tightened on the desk, her knuckles whitening under the studio lights. The control room's big monitor showed the split screen. Monique calm, centered, speaking directly into the camera. Vicky stiff, blinking more than usual. Monique pressed on. "You asked about voter ID? Here are the facts. These laws disproportionately affect elderly voters, students, and working families. In Georgia, we accept concealed carry permits as valid ID, but not student IDs. That's not about security. That's about suppression." Vicky opened her mouth, searching for an interruption, but Monique's tone cut across like a closing argument. "You asked about the border? Real security means comprehensive reform, addressing root causes, and treating asylum seekers humanely. Building walls doesn't stop people fleeing violence. It just makes their journeys more dangerous." Every word landed like a carefully placed exhibit in a trial. Karen, standing behind the cameras, knew they were losing the frame. She gestured frantically to Vicky to interject, but each time the host leaned forward, Monique simply kept talking. "You asked about spending? The Inflation Reduction Act, which I supported, is projected to reduce the deficit by $90 billion. The infrastructure bill is creating jobs in my district and across the country. Meanwhile, your network championed corporate tax cuts that added trillions to the deficit." The director's voice came through the comms. 2 minutes to break." Vicky tried again. "Congresswoman, with all due respect." "Respect?" Monique's eyebrow lifted, her tone firm but calm. "You've shown no respect for this conversation, for the issues, or for the office I hold. You invited me on to discuss policy, then spent the interview preventing me from discussing policy." The words hung in the air, heavy and unhurried. In living rooms across America, viewers could feel the shift. What had been Vicky's show 5 minutes ago was now Monique's courtroom. "But here's what really bothers me," Monique went on, leaning in slightly. "You make millions of dollars every year convincing your audience that people like me, black women, young Democrats, progressive voices, are the enemy. You profit from division, while communities like mine live with the real consequences of the policies you promote." Dan muttered under his breath, "That's the clip. That's the one they'll replay." And Monique's voice stayed steady. "So before you question my credibility, ask yourself, what does it say about your journalism that you can't let a guest finish a sentence? And what does it say about your character that you've built a career on silencing voices like mine?" The silence after that was the kind you could measure in heartbeats. Vicky's eyes flickered to the countdown clock. 10 seconds to break. She forced a thin smile. "We need to take a commercial break," she said, voice lower than before. But the damage was done. Monique sat back, folding her hands again, the very image of calm. She knew the control room was already scrambling, and she knew her words would be everywhere before the hour was over. In the studio, the red on-air light dimmed as they cut to ads. Vicky exhaled sharply, swiveling in her chair away from the camera. In D.C., Monique took a sip from her water glass, as if she'd just completed another ordinary day's work. "You asked about voter ID. Let's talk about what that really means in Georgia." Monique Harris didn't raise her voice when they came back from commercial. She didn't need to. The authority was in her pace, in the way she measured each word as if laying a brick. On the split screen, she sat framed by a stack of policy binders and a shaded view of the mall at dusk, her posture easy, her eyes steady on the lens. Across from her, hundreds of miles away in Manhattan, Vicky Carver lifted her chin a fraction. The host's smile was technically present. Teeth, gloss, the familiar camera-ready warmth, but it didn't quite make it to her eyes. In the control room, Dan Reeves rolled his chair an inch closer to the console, one finger hovering over the widened macro. Karen Douglas stood with her arms crossed, headset crooked against her hair, watching every micro-expression on both faces. "Voter ID," Monique continued, "sounds simple until you look at the details. If you're a college freshman with a student ID and no car, Georgia won't accept that ID at the polls. But if you have a concealed carry permit, you're good. So let's be honest. This isn't about verifying identity. It's about whom we make voting easier for and whom we make it harder for." Vicky shifted her papers, found a line she could press. "Congresswoman, that's a cute talking point." "It's a statistic," Monique said, still mild. "And it's a policy choice. Elderly voters in rural counties with shuttered DMVs, shift workers who can't take a day off just to track down a birth certificate that costs money and time, those are real people. We're not talking theory. We're talking whether they get a say in the government that taxes their paychecks." Dan flicked the preview to a two-shot that held longer than usual. The show's grammar had changed. Where the edit used to hop with Vicky's tempo, question, cut, interruption, cut, now it lingered on the space Monique carved. He could almost feel the audience leaning in from their couches. Vicky placed her palms flat on the desk, as if to anchor the conversation. "Fine. You want to talk, people? Let's talk about the people along the border who are dealing with the consequences of your party's policies." Monique inclined her head. "Let's. Immigration can't be solved with a 3-word slogan, and you know it. Real security is comprehensive. Modern ports of entry, more immigration judges to reduce backlogs, coordinated anti-cartel efforts with Mexico and Central American partners. And while we're at it, if we're going to talk fiscal responsibility, let's be consistent. Family separation and miles of wall in open desert cost billions without fixing root causes." "Root causes," Vicky repeated, that old quick spark catching in her eyes, like a match trying to light in the wind. "There it is. Poverty, violence, and climate pressures," Monique said, unfazed. "They don't disappear because we build a taller fence. We can debate solutions, but we shouldn't pretend that slogans are strategy." Karen leaned into her mic. "Vicky, economy, economy," she prompted, the word soft but urgent over IFB. If there was a lane to rebuild control, it was pocketbook politics. Vicky nodded almost imperceptibly. "Speaking of strategy, Congresswoman, Americans are staring at prices that punch them in the gut every week. Gas, eggs, rent. You voted for a spending spree your party swore wouldn't drive inflation. How's that working out?" Monique didn't flinch. "I meet constituents at grocery store parking lots every month. I know the prices. Some of that inflation was post-pandemic supply shock and corporate pricing power, not a line item on a bill. And while we were stabilizing the economy, we also passed an infrastructure law that's repaving highways in my district and a manufacturing law that's bringing battery jobs to the state. People don't pay the word spending. They pay for broken bridges and long commutes. We're fixing those." "Fixing?" Vicky echoed. "So you're saying everything's fine?" "I'm saying governing is what happens when the camera turns off," Monique replied. "Families feel relief when we cap insulin at $35 for seniors. They feel relief when broadband reaches their town. That isn't a soundbite. It's a pharmacy receipt and a kid doing homework online without sitting in a fast food parking lot." For the first time since the segment began, a wry note touched Vicky's mouth, something like respect, or maybe irritation dressed as it. She tried a pivot that had rescued 100 segments. "But when your colleagues talk about defunding police," Monique didn't let the framing stand. "I support making communities safer. That includes investing in officers' training and accountability, and also in after-school programs that keep kids busy at 4 p.m. When you're a defense attorney for long enough, you learn real quick. You can't jail your way out of every social problem. Public safety is a both-and, not an either-or." Dan felt a small reluctant admiration stirring. It wasn't that Monique was faster. Vicky had speed to spare. It was that Monique refused to sprint. She insisted on middle distance, on stamina, on finishing the thought. And somehow, in the space of 2 segments, she had convinced the cameras to run her race. "Let me ask you something else," Monique said, her tone still even. "Do you think your audience would be better served by a conversation or by an interruption?" Vicky's laugh was quick, practiced. "This is television, Congresswoman." "Exactly," Monique said. "And it goes into living rooms where people are trying to decide if anyone in Washington sees them. If we can slow down long enough to answer, they might hear something useful." Karen's pen drummed against her clipboard. The brand was clarity through combat. The show thrived on whiplash. And yet here they were, letting a guest move at the speed of thought. "All right," Vicky said, tapping the edge of her notepad. "You've had your sermon." "A conversation," Monique corrected gently. "Your conversation," Vicky allowed. "Let me be crystal clear then. Do you or do you not support expanding the Supreme Court?" Monique didn't look away. "I support reforms that restore public trust. Term limits like every other major democracy. A binding ethics code so justices can't accept luxury trips from donors. If a future Congress chose to add seats, as it has in American history, the goal should be restoring balance, not scoring points. I know you want a yes, no. Governance rarely works that way." "That's convenient," Vicky said, finding a firmer foothold. "It's honest," Monique said. "And honesty is the most conservative value I know." For half a second, Vicky's eyes flickered. Just that. Dan caught it and punched in a tight shot, knowing the audience at home would feel the microbeat even if they couldn't name it. "Let's get back to credibility," Vicky said, regaining her edge. "You took a swipe at this network last segment. Most people watching don't care about industry court cases. They care about their kids' schools, crime in their neighborhoods, the flag, faith. You used to be a defense attorney. You know how to pick a jury. Why not talk to this one?" "Because I respect this one," Monique said. "Enough to tell the truth. Media institutions owe viewers the courage to say when they were wrong and how they'll do better. Politicians owe the same. I can take my lumps. Can you?" The question didn't land like a punch. It landed like a mirror. Vicky looked into it and chose her angle. "I can take a debate," she said crisply. "So debate this. Why do your policies so often feel like lectures to the working class?" Monique thought of Mr. Jennings, a 68-year-old retired forklift operator who came to every town hall with a list in his back pocket written in block letters. She thought of the small church in South DeKalb that ran a food pantry out of its fellowship hall, where the pastor knew everybody's name and everybody's favorite pie. "They shouldn't," she said, "and when they do, we need to fix our tone. Work is dignity. Policy should honor that. When I talk about climate investments, it's not to scold someone for driving an old pickup. It's to make sure the new factory making heat pumps breaks ground in their county. When I talk about student debt, it's not to ignore the welder. It's to ask why she pays a higher tax rate than a hedge fund manager." Vicky opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "So you admit your party has a tone problem?" "I admit we're human," Monique said, a hint of tired humor settling in. "So are you." It was disarming, that last part. Vicky's instinct was to swat it away with a quip. She didn't. The moment teetered. Karen exhaled audibly over IFB, then clicked her pen as if that could reset gravity. "Let me bring this home," Monique said. "You've asked me about identity, borders, budgets, and crime. All of those are about one thing: who counts? Do we build systems that treat people like statistics or neighbors? When I was a public defender, I watched judges who could quiet a courtroom without raising their voice. They did it by listening first. This job isn't so different." Vicky found a smile again, this one steadier. "And yet you chose politics, not the bench." "Politics chose me," Monique said. "I kept meeting clients whose lives were downstream of decisions made in rooms they couldn't enter. I decided to sit in those rooms and leave the door open behind me." Dan switched to a side angle of Vicky, the one that made the skyline behind her look like a posture brace, and then back to Monique, whose shot had softened with the D.C. evening. It was uncharacteristically gentle television, and yet the chat metrics spiked on the second monitor. Viewers weren't fleeing, they were typing. "Congresswoman," Vicky said, "some folks will hear you and think you're reasonable. Others will hear you and think you're dodging. That's the divide." "It's the design," Monique said. "Divides are profitable." "And who profits?" Vicky asked, pouncing on the rhetorical ledge she knew well. "Whoever convinces us our neighbors are our enemies," Monique said. "Sometimes that's politicians. Sometimes that's media. Sometimes it's a social media algorithm that nudges outrage because calm doesn't click. I'm not naive about any of that. But there's a reason small-town diners still put a carafe of coffee on the table and let you sit. People need longer conversations than a segment usually allows." Vicky cocked an eyebrow. "Are you asking for more time?" "I'm asking for better time," Monique said. There it was, the line that would print clean in tomorrow's write-ups, the one communications directors would underline in emails to their bosses. Better time. Karen, to her credit, didn't roll her eyes. She didn't have time. The rundown told her they were inside 4 minutes, and the next booking, an economist with a sharp jawline and sharper sound bites, was already in the satellite queue. "Let's touch the economy again," Vicky said, carrying herself back to the terrain she knew could spark. "You said insulin caps are relief. What do you say to the family whose rent went up 10% and who can't find a starter home because interest rates are through the roof?" "I say we should build more housing," Monique replied. "Zoning reform, where we can push for it. Low-interest financing for builders of workforce units. Down payment assistance for first-time buyers. Congress can't set the Fed's rates, but we can make supply less of a stranglepoint, and we should go after corporate landlords, buying up whole neighborhoods sight unseen." "Now you sound like you want to punish success," Vicky said. "I want to prevent monopolies," Monique said. "Conservatives used to like that idea." A quick spark in Vicky's eye again, this time not a match in the wind, but a soldering iron touching a wire. "You're comfortable lecturing conservatives on conservatism?" "I'm comfortable reminding Americans of shared roots," Monique said. We used to agree that concentrated power, whether in government or boardrooms, needed checks. That's not left or right, that's American. The control room's clock turned ruthless. Dan hated that about television, the way time went from a pool you could swim in to a funnel you couldn't escape. Karen lifted her hand and began the silent countdown that only hosts could see. A raised palm, 10, then fingers folding in. "Last question," Vicky said, moving to the close with a cadence she could hit in her sleep. "If you could say one thing to my audience, the folks who don't vote like you, who don't watch the channels you watch, what would it be?" Monique didn't hesitate. "We're neighbors," she said. "That means I will keep trying to solve problems, even when we disagree on the slogans for those solutions. If you call my office because your mom's Social Security check is late, or your small business hit a wall of paperwork, my team will help. We won't ask how you voted. We'll ask your mom's name and your business hours. I can't promise we'll fix everything. I can promise I won't treat you like an enemy." Vicky nodded once, almost to herself, as if that landed somewhere she hadn't expected. She opened her mouth to steer the emotion into a signature close, tough, brisk, polished. Monique added softly, "And I'll keep asking for better time." A beat. On a different night, Vicky might have rapped with a clean line and a little fireworks. Tonight, she swallowed the impulse and opted for neutral. "We'll be right back," she said, clearing her throat. "Stay with us." In the brief exhale that followed, Dan cut to a wide of the set as the music swelled. Karen let her pen rest. The control room wasn't triumphant or defeated. It was startled, like a dog who'd barked and then heard an echo answer back in its own register. On the DC side, Monique muted her mic and took a sip of water, the kind of absent-minded drink you take when the thing you meant to do is finally underway. She watched the small standby light on the corner of her screen and thought of her district, the strip malls with nail salons and tax prep storefronts, the brick ranches with azaleas that flared pink every spring, the Wednesday night Bible study at New Hope Missionary where the deacons kept folding chairs in the back room just in case. When the light flicked back to green, she set the glass down and squared her shoulders. The segment opened to a fresh graphic, Economy, the real numbers, and Vicky tried to relaunch, voice crisp, cadence reclaimed. Congresswoman Harris, a quick lightning round. Monique smiled with her eyes, just a little. "With respect, Vicky, if we're going to talk numbers, let's give them room to breathe. Lightning is pretty, it's not very illuminating." A couple of crew members in Manhattan hiss-laughed, a reflex they'd regret later. Vicky heard it because after all these years, she could hear everything. She set her jaw and adjusted by a hair's width, then drove a question hard enough to leave tread marks. "Then answer this one with all the time you want. Why should anyone believe the people who missed inflation in the first place will get it right now?" Monique didn't blink. "Because we can learn in public, and because policy isn't a crystal ball, it's a steering wheel. When a curve surprises you, you turn, you slow down, you avoid the ditch. You don't let go and say, 'Well, we didn't predict that curve, so I guess the car drives itself now.'" Dan mouthed, "Nice," before catching himself. Karen didn't smile, but she stopped drumming the pen. Monique finished the thought. "I'm not asking your viewers to take comfort in slogans. I'm asking them to watch what happens over the next 6 months, where the jobs land, whether supply chains keep untangling, whether their commute gets better because a 2-lane bottleneck became 3. Hold me accountable for that, not for a meme." Vicky took a breath that was just slightly audible in her mic. She could feel the clock like a hand at her back. She was good enough to surf it, but not even the best surfer wins against a tide. She searched for the old lever, the interruption that would reset gravity, and discovered the mechanism was sticky. She went to the tool she trusted last, the close. "Congresswoman Monique Harris," she said, "we appreciate you joining us tonight." Monique nodded, gentle. "Thanks for having me." Vicky's eyes flicked to the studio timer. The red digits stared back, unsentimental. Vicky's lips part to speak, but the segment timer on the studio screen is nearly at 0. The red light above the camera had gone dark, but the tension in the newsfront studio was still electric. Vicky Carver sat frozen for a few seconds longer than necessary, pretending to shuffle her papers. The commercial break timer ticked down on the monitor in front of her, 90 seconds until they were live again. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks. Her producer's voice buzzed in her earpiece, calm but firm. "We'll pivot after the break. Lighter topic. Control the close." Control. The word felt bitter in that moment. She'd built her career on never losing it, and yet millions had just watched her lose it to a first-term Congresswoman. Off camera, Karen Douglas was already tapping furiously on her tablet, sending notes to the social media team. "Clip will be everywhere. Get ahead of it." In her Capitol Hill office, Monique Harris removed the small earpiece and took a slow breath. Her staff, gathered just out of frame during the interview, erupted into muffled cheers. Monique raised a hand, smiling faintly. "It's not over yet. They still have 2 minutes left of airtime." But she knew the real battle had already been won. When the break ended, Vicky's smile returned, smaller, tighter, the kind a person wears when the photographer says just one more. "We're back," she said brightly, "with Congresswoman Monique Harris." The remaining questions were softer, almost perfunctory. Something about bipartisan cooperation, another about local infrastructure projects. Monique answered smoothly, staying measured, never gloating. She didn't need to. By the time Vicky wrapped the segment, the split screen told the story. The host ending on a forced smile, the guest with the calm composure of someone who had said exactly what she came to say. The fallout began before the closing credits rolled. Clips of Monique's credibility line, her 9th sentence, were already circulating on Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. The phrasing was too sharp, too undeniable to ignore. By midnight, Monique Harris was trending nationwide. Even political accounts that normally avoided praising Democrats couldn't resist commenting. One conservative blogger wrote, "I disagree with her politics, but she just outplayed Carver on her own show. That's not easy." The reaction inside Newsfront was far less charitable. In the glass-walled executive conference room on the 14th floor, senior producers replayed the clip in silence. They watched Vicky's confident smirk evaporate, watched the pause stretch too long, watched Monique seize the moment like a lawyer dropping Exhibit A into the record. Finally, the network president broke the silence. "We can't let this happen again." The next morning, Monique's phone didn't stop buzzing. Invitations from cable shows, some friendly, some not. Requests for radio spots, podcast interviews, panel discussions. Even late-night comedy shows wanted her. Her comms director grinned. "You just went national, boss." Monique sipped her coffee, eyes scanning the morning headlines. She understood the temptation to celebrate, but her instincts told her this moment was bigger than a viral clip. Because beneath all the noise, applause from her supporters, grumbling from her detractors, there was a clear message. A new generation of politicians didn't have to play by the old rules, and she had just proved it live on national television. The voice on the other end was warm but direct. "Congresswoman Harris, this is Victor Salazar from the Minority Leader's Office. The leader watched your interview last night. He'd like you to join our leadership strategy meeting tomorrow morning." Monique's pen hovered above her legal pad. "Of course," she said, her tone even. Inside, she felt the shift, an invisible door swinging open. By noon, the moment had fully escaped the boundaries of cable news. University political science classes were dissecting her exchange with Vicky Carver. One professor at Georgetown emailed her students, "Required viewing. This is a blueprint for handling hostile media." Progressive PACs blasted fundraising emails with her photo and the subject line, "This is how we fight back." Contributions poured in from every state. Even some conservative commentators, though begrudgingly, acknowledged the skill of her counterpunch. On a talk radio program in Ohio, a caller said, "Look, I don't agree with her on much, but she didn't let that host walk all over her. Respect where it's due." Inside Newsfront, the mood was defensive. Senior producers drafted new guest management guidelines. Keep control of pacing. Don't let the guest reframe the narrative. Avoid direct mention of the Dominion settlement. Vicky Carver arrived at work wearing a mask of confidence, but the staff noticed how quickly she moved past any discussion of the segment. She'd weathered bad press before, but never a viral moment that stripped away her strongest weapon: control. Monique, meanwhile, wasn't treating it like a personal victory. In the minority leader's office the next day, she framed it as a collective opportunity. "We can't keep playing defense," she told the room. "We have to know their tactics better than they do and be ready to turn them." Veteran members nodded, some with surprise, others with a flicker of pride. The leader leaned back in his chair. "You've shown us what that looks like." Over the next weeks, her schedule exploded. Town halls, policy roundtables, keynote speeches at youth political conferences. In every Q&A, someone brought up the interview. They'd ask, "How did you stay so calm?" She'd answer, "Preparation beats intimidation every time." By summer, young organizers were referring to the tactic simply as the Harris play. Campaign training seminars used her clip as a module on reframing hostile interviews. The phrase, "Are you finished?" took on a life of its own, appearing on T-shirts, mugs, and protest signs. One evening, months later, Monique stood backstage at a university auditorium. She could hear the crowd of students settling into their seats. Her aide whispered, "Full house, they're here for you." She smiled. Not for me, for the idea. When she stepped into the spotlight, the applause swelled. She thought back to that night on Newsfront, not as the night she won a TV segment, but as the moment she'd proved something larger, that the next generation didn't have to play by the old rules, that in the right hands, truth could be just as sharp as any interruption, and that sometimes all it took to change the conversation was one perfectly timed sentence. There's a certain stillness that lingers after the storm has passed, a quiet space where the echoes of voices fade, and all that remains is the memory of how it felt. I imagine that's where Monique Harris stood in her own mind after that interview, not with the thrill of victory, but with the calm of someone who had simply spoken her truth. For many watching, especially in the Black community, it wasn't just about politics or a viral clip. It was about dignity reclaimed in a place where it was never freely given. You see, over the course of my years, I've learned that it's not always the loudest voice that carries the most weight. Sometimes it's the one that waits, steady and sure, for the right moment to speak. And when it does, the whole room changes. That night, Monique's composure became a mirror, showing the world that real strength is often quiet, measured, and rooted in purpose. For the Black community, long accustomed to having to prove worth before being heard, her steady stance was more than a rebuttal. It was a reminder that our stories, our values, and our voices belong in every room, no matter how hostile. The lesson is simple, but it's one worth holding close. Keep your dignity, even when others try to strip it away. Stand for the truth, even if the truth shakes the walls. Speak with humanity, so that even those who oppose you can't deny the light in your words. In my own life, I've seen that justice and compassion often arrive from the least expected places, sometimes from the very people the world underestimated, and like a porch light burning steady through the night, a single act of courage can guide others through their darkest roads. So I think about all those moments in life when we're tempted to measure a person by the surface, the suit they wear, the title they hold, the way they sound when they speak. And I think about how many times I've been proven wrong, how many times someone I barely noticed became the one to change the entire conversation. Monique Harris reminded me, and maybe reminded you, that the truth doesn't always come dressed in the power we're used to seeing. Sometimes it comes from the place we looked past, the person we thought could be brushed aside. If you've stayed with me this far, take a moment now. Think of the times in your own life when you saw courage in an unexpected corner. Let that memory sit with you. Let it warm you. And if this story touched something in you, consider passing that warmth along to someone who might be fighting their own quiet battle. Because in the end, every community, especially the Black community, needs these reminders. that the smallest voice can rise, the overlooked can prevail, and the truth can still find its way into the light.